The security guard's hand was already on her arm. He was pulling her toward the door, firm, efficient like he'd done it before, while a room full of tailored suits and evening gowns watched without moving. Nobody said a word. Nobody needed to. The way they looked at her said everything. Then a man near the back of the room stood up. He wasn't the tallest person there, wasn't the best dressed. He just walked forward, stopped in front of the guard, and spoke in a voice so calm it cut through the entire room. "She's with me." Marcus Hale had not planned on being at a place like this on a Tuesday night. He owned a repair shop on a side street in Queens, the kind of place where the floor was always stained and the coffee was always bad, and nobody cared either way. He knew how to rebuild a transmission from scratch. He knew which distributors overcharged and which ones were worth calling back. What he did not know, and had never needed to know, was how to move through a room full of people who wore their wealth the way other people wore cologne, quietly, completely impossible to ignore. Don Seaver had called him 3 days earlier. Don was a parts supplier Marcus had worked with for years, dependable and straight-talking, the kind of man who skipped small talk and got to numbers fast. He had a seat at a private dinner in Manhattan, some investment gathering hosted by a man named Gerald Fitch, and he told Marcus there might be a supply deal worth discussing in person. Marcus had said yes, mostly because Don had never steered him wrong before, and partly because he hadn't left Queens for anything other than work in longer than he cared to admit. He arrived at the restaurant on time, which turned out to be the wrong instinct. Everyone else arrived late deliberately. It seemed as if earliness were something to be ashamed of. By the time the private room filled up, Marcus had already finished one drink and was running low on patience. The table was long and dark-wooded, and set with the kind of silverware that required a decision. The guests filed in with practiced ease voices. Low laughter measured every handshake, landing at exactly the right pressure. Marcus sat near the far end and kept to himself, watching Don work the room with the comfort of a man who had done this many times before. The room felt sealed off from everything outside it. No street noise reached the windows. The lighting was warm in the way that expensive lighting always was, soft enough to flatter, bright enough to see who was watching you. Marcus drank water and listened to a conversation beside him about a real estate acquisition in New Jersey without contributing a single word. He was not embarrassed by this. He simply had nothing to add. That was when he noticed her. She was standing near the far wall just inside the entrance, and she did not belong in the room, not because of anything she did, but because of what she wore. The jacket was the kind of thing you bought when money was tight and kept wearing, past the point when it should have been replaced. It was clean, but tired, the kind of tired that doesn't wash out. Everything else in the room was pressed and polished and chosen with intention. Her jacket was just a jacket, and in that room, that was enough to make her visible in the worst possible way. She was not causing a scene. She was not speaking too loudly or reaching for food that wasn't hers. She was simply standing there, looking toward the far end of the table, as if she were looking for a specific face. But the way the other guests glanced at her, quick sideways with the particular kind of stillness that precedes judgment, made it clear that her presence had already been decided upon. She had been categorized before anyone had spoken a word to her. Marcus watched this happen the way you watch weather come in. Slow then, all at once. The security guard's name was Ray, and he crossed the room with the efficiency of someone who had been given a task and intended to complete it. He did not ask Lillian Ward any questions. He placed his hand on her arm, firm and directional, and began moving her toward the door. The message was physical before it was verbal. "You are being removed, and the room has already agreed to this." Lillian did not pull back. She did not raise her voice. She let herself be moved, and that was somehow the worst part of it. The way she accepted it, like she had already calculated that resistance would only make things worse. The room watched. Not openly, nobody turned fully in their seat. But Marcus could feel the collective attention shift toward the door, the way a group of people will track something without admitting they're looking. A few guests leaned slightly toward each other. One woman near the center of the table touched the stem of her wine glass and said nothing. Marcus set down his water. He was not a man who made decisions slowly when something was happening in front of him that he could see clearly. He had learned a long time ago that the moment you start calculating the cost of doing something decent, you have already started moving away from it. So he did not calculate. He stood up, and he walked toward the door, and he stopped in front of Ray with enough presence that Ray's grip on Lillian's arm went still. "She's with me," Marcus said. The words came out quiet. That was what made the room go still. Not the volume, but the certainty behind it. There was no apology in the way he said it, no nervousness, no performance. Just a statement delivered as though it were simply and obviously true. Ray looked at him. The calculation behind the guard's eyes was visible. He was weighing the situation, reading Marcus's posture, deciding whether this was worth a confrontation. Marcus held the look without blinking. He had spent enough years dealing with difficult people across a counter to know that steadiness, more than aggression, was what made someone back down. Ray let go of Lillian's arm. Lillian turned and looked at Marcus. Her expression was not grateful. Not yet, it was something more complicated than gratitude. It was the look of a person trying to figure out what had just happened, and whether it was going to make things better or worse. She studied his face the way you study a door before deciding whether to open it. Marcus met her eyes and said nothing. He had made the move. He didn't know what came next, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. What he did know was that he had put himself in a position that had no clean exit. He had just told an entire room full of strangers that he knew this woman, and he had absolutely no idea who she was. The whispers started at the edges of the room, low and sideways, the way whispers always do when a room full of people has something to talk about, but hasn't decided yet how loudly. Marcus could feel them without needing to hear the words. He pulled out the empty chair beside him and looked at Lillian, not a question, just an indication. She looked at the chair for a moment, then at the room, then back at him, and she sat down. The chair made a small sound against the floor when Lillian pulled it closer to the table. Around them, the room pretended to return to its previous conversations, but the pretense was thin. Marcus could feel the attention still on them, redistributed, but not gone the way heat moves around a room rather than leaving it. He picked up his water glass and looked straight ahead, giving the people behind him no expression worth reporting. Gerald Fitch appeared at the head of the table before Marcus had time to think through what he was going to say. Fitch was the kind of man who had learned to make his authority look like hospitality. He smiled when he walked over, but the smile was the kind that asked questions rather than offered warmth. He was somewhere in his late 50s, broad-shouldered with the easy posture of someone who had not been told no in a very long time. "Marcus." Fitch's voice was smooth and unhurried. "I don't believe I had the chance to include a +1 on your invitation." The way he said it left room for Marcus to apologize, to explain, to make it easy for everyone. Marcus recognized the mechanism. He had seen the same move in negotiations give someone a door-marked exit and see if they take it. "She's with me," Marcus said again. Same words, same tone. He did not expand on them. Fitch looked at Lillian for a moment, a brief assessing look that landed and lifted without acknowledgement, then looked back at Marcus with a smile that had recalibrated itself. "Of course," he said. "I'll have another setting arranged." He moved away with the unhurried confidence of someone who had filed the situation under unresolved and intended to return to it later. Lillian watched him go. Then she turned to Marcus, and her voice came out low enough that only he could hear it. "You don't know who I am," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," Marcus said. She studied him for a moment the same way she had at the door, measuring careful as though she were checking for something that usually wasn't there. Then she looked down at the table and straightened the edge of her napkin with one finger. "Then why did you do that?" Marcus thought about how to answer that, not because he didn't know, but because the truth was simple enough that it sounded insufficient. Because nobody in this room was going to, he said finally, and that seemed like a problem. Lillian said nothing to that. She turned her attention to the room in a way that looked casual, but wasn't. Her eyes moved with a precision that Marcus noticed, though he couldn't yet name what it meant. The dinner continued around them. Courses arrived and were cleared. The conversations at the table were the kind that sounded like business, without ever committing to anything specific, mentions of acquisitions, returns, developments, in markets that Marcus did not follow. Don Seaver caught Marcus's eye from across the table once and gave him a look that was mostly confusion and a little bit of respect. Marcus gave him nothing back. After a while, the silence between Marcus and Lillian became less uncomfortable and more like a truce. She accepted the glass of water that a server placed in front of her and drank from it slowly. Marcus noticed that she did not look at the menu, did not flag. A server did not try to make herself comfortable in the room. She was still watching it, still reading it with the same quiet focus she'd had when he first saw her near the wall. He decided to say something, not because he needed to fill the silence, but because the situation they were in was specific enough that pretending they were acquaintances required at least some of the basic materials of conversation. "Who were you looking for?" Marcus asked. Lillian turned her head toward him. She considered the question as if deciding how much of the answer was necessary. "A man named Arthur Doyle," she said. "He's at the far end of the table. We were supposed to meet tonight. He said he could connect me with someone who had an opening at a firm I've been trying to reach for months." She looked toward that end of the table, where a man in a gray suit was deep in conversation with the woman beside him. "He didn't mention it was a private event." Marcus followed her gaze. Arthur Doyle, from what Marcus could see, was the kind of man who made a lot of promises in rooms like this, because rooms like this made promises feel consequential. "You came here for a job lead," Marcus said. "Yes." She said it plainly, without embarrassment, which Marcus noted. Most people, when caught in a situation like this one, would have reached for a version of the story that made them sound less exposed. Lillian didn't. She said what was true and left it there. Marcus nodded and said nothing more about it. He cut into the food that had been placed in front of him and let the conversation rest. It was about 40 minutes later when things changed. Marcus did not see exactly how it started. He was listening to Don explain something about a brake component shortage when he felt the room shift, not loudly, but in the specific way a room shifts, when information passes through it and rearranges the furniture of everyone's attention. He looked up and saw it moving table by table, heads turning, voices dropping, then rising. Someone near the center of the table looked at Lillian with an expression that had completely replaced the one they'd been wearing an hour ago. Gerald Fitch was standing near the entrance with his phone in his hand and a look on his face that Marcus couldn't read from across the room. He spoke briefly to the man beside him. The man nodded and looked toward where Marcus and Lillian were sitting. Lillian noticed none of this, or if she did, she didn't show it. Then the woman who had been fingering her wine glass earlier, the one who had said nothing when Ray was pulling Lillian toward the door, leaned across the table with a smile that appeared to have been assembled very quickly. "I'm sorry I didn't catch your name earlier," she said to Lillian, her voice now carrying the particular warmth of someone who had just learned they'd been rude to someone who mattered. Lillian looked at her. "Lillian Ward," she said. The name landed in the room like a stone into still water. Marcus watched it move. He watched faces recalibrate. He watched postures straighten and expressions reorganize themselves into something socially safer. The change was not dramatic. These were people who had spent years learning to rearrange themselves without appearing to. But it was visible to anyone paying attention, and Marcus had been paying attention to this room all night. Arthur Doyle from the far end of the table suddenly found an opportunity to stand up and move in their direction. He arrived with the energy of someone with a correction to make. "Lillian," he said, reaching for her hand with both of his. "I should have met you at the door. I apologize for the confusion earlier." The confusion. That was what he called it. Lillian shook his hand with no warmth and no hostility, just the neutral grip of someone completing a formality. "We can talk later," she said. "I'm in the middle of something." Doyle looked at Marcus with a brief recalibrated smile, then retreated back toward his end of the table. Marcus sat with what he'd just seen. He turned it over in his mind, the way he turned a problem over in the shop, looking for where the actual failure was not just the symptom. Ward. He had heard that name. He couldn't say exactly where, but he had heard it in the context of money. Serious money, institutional money, the kind that didn't show up at charity events, but showed up in the structures underneath them. Ward Holdings was a name that appeared in the background of things. You didn't see it on storefronts or products. You saw it in ownership records and board compositions if you knew to look. He looked at Lillian, the same woman who 45 minutes ago had been walked to the door by a security guard without a single person in this room raising their hand. The same woman sitting beside him, now in a worn jacket, while half the table arranged itself around her like iron filings around a magnet. He felt something settle in his chest. Not quite anger, not quite something he had a name for. It was the particular feeling of understanding a situation so clearly that the clarity itself became uncomfortable. Fitch came back to the table with a different kind of smile than before. This one was reparative, the smile of a host, managing a mistake he had only just been informed he'd made. "Miss Ward, I want to express personally how sorry I am for any misunderstanding this evening." He gestured toward the room, as though the misunderstanding were environmental. "We weren't expecting—" "I know you weren't," Lillian said. The way she said it stopped Fitch's apology before it completed itself. She did not say it rudely. She said it in the tone of someone stating a fact they had already made peace with. Fitch nodded once, recovered his composure, and moved away. Around the table, the conversations that resumed were different from the ones that had been happening before. Quieter. More careful. More than once, Marcus saw someone glance in their direction and look away quickly when they made eye contact with him. He didn't know what they were making of him, the man in the serviceable blazer who had claimed Lillian Ward, and he found he didn't particularly want to know. What he was thinking about was something else entirely. He was thinking about the moment Ray had his hand on Lillian's arm and how not one person at this table had moved. He was thinking about the way the room had watched her get walked toward the door with the communal ease of people who had already agreed silently and without discussion that this was the correct outcome. And now he was watching the same room arrange itself around her like she was the center of gravity. It had been missing all along. Same people, same table, same evening. The only variable was a name. He set down his fork. It wasn't a dramatic motion. He simply set it down, aligned it with the edge of his plate, and looked at the middle distance for a moment. Then he looked at Lillian. She was watching the room, not anxiously, not triumphantly, but with the same careful attention she'd had all night. Like she was documenting something, like this was exactly what she'd come to see. And that was the moment Marcus understood fully what the evening actually was. He stood up. The motion caught Lillian's attention immediately. She turned to look at him, and for the first time all evening, something in her expression shifted toward something less controlled, something close to alarm. "You're leaving," she said. "Yes," Marcus said. He pulled his jacket from the back of the chair and laid it over his arm. Around them, several heads turned. The room had become very quiet again, in the way it always seemed to do when Marcus moved or spoke, as though they had all agreed to treat him as a weather system worth tracking. He looked at Lillian, and he said what was true in the same way he had said everything else that evening, without performance, without apology. "I don't know if I would have said something different tonight if I'd known who you were," he said. "Maybe I would have done the same thing, but I'll never know that now, and neither will you." He let that sit for a moment. What I do know is that I don't want to stay in a room where the way people treat you changes the second they learn your last name. That's not a misunderstanding. That's just who these people are. Lillian looked at him. She said nothing. I hope the job lid works out, Marcus said. And then he nodded, once picked up his jacket and walked toward the door. The room let him go in silence. Nobody stopped him. Nobody said anything at all. He passed Ray without looking at him, pushed through the door and stepped out into the cold air of the street, where the city was loud and indifferent, and exactly what it had always been. Inside, Lillian Ward sat at the head of a table full of people who were now very interested in speaking with her, and she looked at the empty chair beside her, and she did not say a single word. The car that took Lillian back across the bridge that night was quiet and warm and entirely too comfortable. She sat in the back seat and watched the city lights move past the window and thought about an empty chair. Not about Arthur Doyle, who had spent the remainder of the evening explaining himself in ways that made the original offense worse. Not about Gerald Fitch, who had transformed his apology into a pitch before the dessert course arrived. Not about the woman with the wine glass who had asked for Lillian's contact information, with the practiced warmth of someone who had decided to invest in a relationship they had initially written off. Lillian had seen all of it before the reversal, the recalibration, the sudden discovery of warmth towards someone whose last name carried weight. That part of the evening held no surprises. What she kept returning to was the chair, the way it sat empty after Marcus walked out, the way nobody at the table mentioned his departure or his name, the way the room had simply absorbed his absence, the same way it had absorbed her presence by arranging itself around what remained and moving forward. She had gone to that dinner deliberately. That was the part she turned over on the drive home, with a discomfort that was new and specific and not entirely comfortable. She had worn the old jacket on purpose. She had arrived without announcement, without the name, without any of the infrastructure that usually preceded her. She had wanted to see what a room full of people like that would do with someone they had no reason to be careful with. She had done this before, not often, but enough to know what rooms like that produced. They always produced the same result. She had been prepared for it. She had told herself, as she always did, that it was useful information. A data point, a confirmation of something she already knew. She had not been prepared for Marcus Hale. The driver made a turn, and the lights shifted, and Lillian pressed her fingers together in her lap and looked at nothing in particular. The discomfort that had settled in her chest during the drive was not guilt exactly. It was something more precise than guilt. It was the specific feeling of having been seen clearly by someone who had no idea they were seeing anything at all. She had constructed the evening as an observation. Marcus had simply walked into it, and without any awareness of the design had become the only real thing in the room. She had been testing the room. He had just been in it. The garage on the side street in Queens was not hard to find. Lillian had not hired anyone to locate it. She had simply remembered the name from the placard on the lanyard Don Seaver had been wearing, which she had read during dinner, the way she read most things automatically and without effort. Hell Automotive. A search took less than 2 minutes. The address came up without complications. She waited 4 days before going. She was not sure why 4 days specifically. It was not a calculated interval, but it felt right in the way that some timings feel right without being explicable. Long enough that showing up didn't look reactive. Short enough that it wasn't a statement about deliberation. The morning she went was overcast, the kind of flat gray sky that made everything look slightly underexposed. She told her driver to pull up to the address and wait, and she got out of the car alone. The garage was exactly what she had expected it to be, which is to say it was exactly what Marcus was straightforward without apology. The exterior was clean, but not decorated. The sign above the bay doors was painted in plain block letters, the kind that communicated information rather than brand. One of the bay doors was open, and from the street, she could hear the specific, purposeful sound of metal on metal, not chaotic, but rhythmic, the sound of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and was doing it. She stood at the edge of the open bay door. Marcus was underneath a dark blue pickup truck on a rolling board, his legs visible from the knees, down one hand, reaching toward something she couldn't see. The radio in the corner was playing something she didn't recognize. The floor had the kind of staining that years of work leave behind, and the walls were lined with shelving parts and tools arranged in an order that probably made immediate sense to anyone who worked here, and no sense at all to anyone who didn't. She had not worn the old jacket. She was in a coat she'd had for years, well-made and dark, the kind of thing she wore to meetings in buildings with good elevators. She felt standing at the entrance to the garage slightly overdressed in a way that was the inverse of how she had felt 4 nights ago, and she was self-aware enough to register the symmetry. "Mr. Hale," she said. The motion under the truck stopped. Then the rolling board slid out, and Marcus looked up at her from the floor with the particular expression of someone who has been surprised, but is processing that surprise before responding to it. He held a wrench in one hand. There was a smear of grease along the side of his forearm. He sat up slowly, then stood. He set the wrench on the nearest surface and looked at her without speaking for a moment, not coldly, but taking the time to understand what was in front of him. "You found the place," he said. "It wasn't difficult," Lillian said. He reached for a shop rag hanging from a hook on the wall and wiped his hands in a way that was automatic and unhurried. He did not ask her what she was doing there. He waited. She had prepared something to say on the drive over. Several versions of it, actually. She had a habit of doing this running language through its options before deploying it, choosing the formulation that was precise without being excessive. But standing at the entrance to the garage with the sound of the radio in the background and Marcus Hale looking at her without expectation or agenda, all of the prepared language felt like the wrong instrument for the situation, so she said what was true. "I came to thank you," she said, "for what you did the other night." Marcus looked at her for a moment. Then he set the rag down on the workbench. "You don't have to do that," he said. Not dismissively, more like he genuinely didn't see the point of the trip. "I know I don't have to," Lillian said. "That's not why I'm here." He nodded once, accepting this. He leaned back slightly against the workbench and crossed his arms, not defensively, just the posture of a man who had stopped moving and was now listening. "How did the rest of the evening go?" It was a straightforward question, and she answered it straightforwardly. "The way those evenings always go," she said. "Once people knew who I was, they were very interested in making sure I remembered them favorably." Marcus said nothing to that. His expression didn't change much, but something in it confirmed what she'd suspected, that he had already understood this would happen before he walked out the door. Lillian stepped slightly further into the garage, enough to be inside it rather than at its threshold. She looked at the shelving, the tools, the organized disorder of a space that was entirely functional and entirely his. "I should tell you something," she said, "about why I went to that dinner the way I did." Marcus waited. She told him the truth. She told it plainly without softening it. The jacket, the lack of announcement, the intention behind her presence. She said she had done this before, and that rooms like that, one always behaved the same way, and that she had gone there prepared to see a version of what she had already seen many times. She did not make it sound like research. She said it the way it actually was, a habit she had developed, a way of taking the measure of a room and the people in it before letting them know they had anything to gain from her presence. When she finished, the garage was quiet except for the radio. Marcus looked at the floor for a moment, not in embarrassment or judgment, but in the manner of someone thinking something through to its end before speaking. Then he looked up. "Did it tell you what you needed to know?" he asked. Lillian considered that. "Most of it," she said. "The part I wasn't expecting was you." Marcus's expression moved slightly, not quite a smile, but something in the direction of one. "I wasn't expecting me either," he said. She looked at him. "Did you know at any point during the evening, did you have any idea who I was?" "No," he said. "Not until the room told me." "And when the room told you?" He thought about how to answer that. She could see him thinking about it, not stalling, but being accurate. "It explained some things," he said. "It didn't change anything I'd already done, and it made me not want to stay." Lillian nodded. That was the part she had been carrying since the drive home 4 nights ago. Not what he had done at the door, though that had been enough, but what he had done after. The willingness to walk away from a room that had suddenly become useful to him. The refusal to stay in a situation that had rearranged itself in his favor. That was the part that didn't fit any category she had spent years building. "Most people wouldn't have left," she said. "Once they knew, most people would have stayed. They would have found a way to make the situation work for them." "I know," Marcus said. "That's why I left." She had no answer for that, so she didn't try to produce one. She stood in the garage and looked at the space around her, the floor, the shelving, the open bay door, with the gray sky beyond it, the truck still waiting on the lift. A space where the measure of things was whether they worked or whether they didn't, and the pretense of wealth carried no particular weight, because the engine either ran or it didn't, and that was the only question that mattered. She thought about the table at Gerald Fitch's dinner and the way it had looked once everyone in the room knew her name. She thought about the smiles that had appeared and the hands that had reached toward her and the voices that had softened into the particular register of people who want something and believe that warmth is the most efficient vehicle for obtaining it. She had grown up surrounded by that register. She could hear it before it arrived. She had made peace with it as the cost of operating in the world she occupied. She had told herself it was simply how things worked. Standing in the garage, she was not sure she believed that anymore. Or rather, she believed it was how things worked, and she no longer believed that was sufficient justification for accepting it. "I meant what I said," she told him. "I'm not here to test you. I'm not here because of your shop or any business reason. I came because you were the only person in that room who treated me like a person before knowing I was worth anything to them. And I wanted you to know that it mattered." Marcus looked at her for a moment. Then he said something that she had not expected. "I didn't do anything special," he said. It was not false modesty, she could hear the difference by now. He meant it. "You were being treated badly in front of a lot of people who were deciding it was none of their business. I disagreed with that. That's the whole thing." "That's the whole thing," Lillian repeated quietly. "Yeah," Marcus said. "It's not complicated. It just looks complicated from inside those rooms because everyone in there has spent so much time making basic things complicated." Lillian looked at the open bay door. Beyond it, the street was ordinary and unhurried, a city block, doing what city blocks do without hierarchy or performance. A woman walked past with a paper coffee cup. A delivery truck double-parked. The gray sky held. She thought about a thing that she had understood theoretically for a long time, but had not felt the full weight of until right now, standing on a floor that smelled like oil and metal in a garage in Queens. The understanding had to do with what people reveal when they believe there is nothing to be gained. Most people in most rooms are managing something, an impression, an advantage, a position. The management is so constant and so practiced that it becomes invisible even to the people doing it. You only see the real shape of a person when there is nothing on the table, when the name means nothing, when the jacket is just a jacket and the room has already made its decision and there is nothing left to calculate. That was where Marcus had existed in that room from the beginning to the end. Outside the calculation, and she had spent enough years inside it to understand clearly and without sentimentality how rare that was. "Thank you," she said again. Simply, without elaboration. Marcus nodded. "Drive safe," he said. Lillian walked back to the car. The driver opened the door, and she got in, and she looked back once at the open bay door, where Marcus was already pulling the rolling board back out from under the truck. The work continuing, the radio still on, the gray sky sitting quietly over everything. She did not know what to do with what she had just understood, not practically, not yet. But she knew what it was. It was the recognition that the most honest room she had been in for years was a garage on a side street in Queens, and the most honest person she had met. And longer than that was a man who fixed engines and had no reason to be kind to her, and had been kind anyway, and who had not stayed around to be thanked for it, and who had not understood what made that remarkable, because to him it was simply what you did. The car pulled into traffic. Lillian looked forward. The city moved past the windows the way it always did, indifferent, continuous without comment. She thought about the empty chair, and this time it didn't feel like a loss. It felt like a measure,